When a bike makes too many headlines for the wrong reasons, it doesn't get a second chance. Whether it was power delivery, pollution, or straight-up danger, these machines crossed a line and never came back. They were fast, loud, unstable, or simply unsafe for public roads. From having poor design to too much power, these machines didn't last long before regulators stepped in. These are the 10 banned motorcycles you'll never ride again. Number 10. Yamaha RD350. At first glance, the Yamaha RD350 did not seem like the kind of machine that would end up off the road. It carried the look of a simple street bike, upright bars, slim frame, and standard wheels. But behind that straightforward appearance was something far more aggressive. Once the key turned and the throttle opened, it became clear this was a bike that delivered more than most riders were ready for, and that imbalance quickly became a problem. From the moment it launched in the early 1970s, the RD350 developed a reputation for being light, sharp, and unexpectedly fast. Yamaha built it with one purpose: performance, and they found it by combining low weight with a snappy, high-strung, two-stroke power plant. The engine itself was an air-cooled parallel twin, displacing 347 cubic centimeters, and designed to hit hard. Once the revs climbed high enough, that hit was not gradual. Power came on with a snap, and for riders unfamiliar with two-strokes, it often felt like the bike shifted personalities mid-ride. This sudden surge of power was what made the RD so exciting and so unpredictable. It forced the rider to stay ahead of the throttle, constantly adjusting inputs to avoid losing traction or oversteering through corners. While the overall output figures were manageable on paper, with torque around 31 pound-feet, the way it was delivered created a margin for error that was far too narrow for street conditions. The chassis, though capable, left little room to recover from mistakes, especially at speed. In places like the United States, the bike quickly found a home among skilled riders who appreciated its raw edge. It was fast, affordable, and mechanically straightforward. However, in other parts of the world, that same simplicity worked against it. When the RD was introduced in India under the Rajdoot name in the mid-1980s, it brought all of its power, but very little in terms of adaptability. The roads were different, the fuel quality varied, and most mechanics had little experience with bikes tuned this aggressively. Problems began to show quickly, maintenance was more demanding than riders expected, and local shops struggled to keep them running properly. The engine required regular tuning, an incorrect setup could lead to detonation, fouled plugs, or sudden performance loss. For a machine that already challenged its riders with sudden acceleration, those extra complications only made things worse. As ownership complaints grew, a second issue emerged in the form of emissions. The RD's two-stroke engine consumed oil by design, releasing visible smoke and high hydrocarbon levels in the process. By the late 1980s, governments were beginning to enforce stricter air quality standards, and the RD no longer fit. Yamaha offered no compliant update, and the two-stroke format made retrofitting unrealistic. Soon, insurance companies began raising rates or refusing coverage. Inspections became stricter, and registration processes stalled. Without an outright legal ban, the bike was quietly pushed off public roads. The restrictions were not just a reaction to pollution, they were a response to a machine that outpaced the infrastructure and support systems around it. The RD350 asked for more attention, more control, and more rider skill than most street environments could support. Once those gaps became clear, the push to remove it from daily use gained momentum. Currently, the few remaining RD350s are either hidden in collections or relegated to off-road use. Legalizing one for street duty in many countries is no longer possible without costly conversions and extensive paperwork. What was once a thrilling, lightweight powerhouse is now remembered as a machine that went beyond the limits of its time and never made it back. Number 9. Suzuki RGV250. It only took one ride to understand that the Suzuki RGV250 was not built for casual street use. It looked sharp, it sounded sharper, and when the power kicked in, it did not ask questions. This was not a bike that eased into its pace. It demanded precision, commitment, and complete focus from the rider. And when those things were missing, the results often followed. Suzuki introduced the RGV250 in the late 1980s as a road-going replica of their GP racing machines. That was not just marketing. The bike borrowed directly from track design, with a compact chassis, aggressive geometry, and a motor that behaved more like a race engine than something meant for traffic. It was a V-twin two-stroke, liquid-cooled, with a displacement of 249 cubic centimeters. But what made it dangerous was not the size. It was how fast it climbed through the revs and how suddenly it came alive once it did. At lower RPMs, the engine felt tame, almost soft. But as soon as the power band arrived, the behavior changed instantly. Acceleration became abrupt, and the torque surged forward in a narrow, hard-hitting band. For experienced riders, that was part of the appeal. For newer ones, it often became the problem. With torque peaking near 26 pound-feet, the numbers were not extreme, but the way the torque was delivered made the bike feel volatile, especially when cornering or rolling on throttle mid-turn. That edge was not softened by the rest of the bike. The suspension was firm, the brakes were sharp, and the handling was tuned for aggressive inputs. There was very little forgiveness built into the setup, and the lack of electronic aids only emphasized the need for rider discipline. Any mistake, downshifting too early, throttling too hard, or braking mid-corner was dealt with immediately and without much room for correction. As emissions regulations tightened through the 1990s, the RGV 250 started running out of time. Its two-stroke engine burned oil with every cycle, sending visible smoke and unburned fuel into the air. Governments across Europe, Australia, and parts of Asia began enforcing stricter limits, and the RGV was soon out of compliance. Suzuki responded by scaling back production and pulling the model from key markets. Some final versions remained available in Japan and select countries, but even those were restricted and eventually phased out completely. That alone could have explained its disappearance. But there was more at play. In many regions, licensing laws were rewritten to control performance access. The RGV 250, once viewed as a lightweight sport bike, was now considered too powerful for entry-level riders and too unstable for general street use. The narrow power band, aggressive ergonomics, and track-inspired geometry made it unsuitable for urban environments. Accidents became more frequent, and insurance companies took notice. Policies were dropped, premiums rose, and riders began moving away from the platform altogether. Over time, the bike's legal path to the road narrowed. In several countries, it became impossible to register new units. Imported models were rejected at inspection stations, and in cities where air quality standards were under pressure, even existing bikes were quietly pushed into retirement. Suzuki made no effort to modernize the design or reintroduce the platform, and the RGV 250 faded into the background, not because it lacked ability, but because the environment around it changed. The RGV exists mostly in private garages and closed-course events today. It still offers a level of excitement that few modern bikes can replicate, but that excitement now comes with restrictions. For riders hoping to experience that power band on the street, the answer is clear: those days are over. If you think these bikes were extreme, just wait. The next ones were faster, wilder, or simply unfit for public roads. Stick around, hit that like button, and subscribe, because the real bands haven't even hit the red line yet. Number 8. Honda CR500R. No badge, no fairings, no polite warnings. Just a tall seat, a long lever, and a reputation that came long before the first kick. The Honda CR500R was never designed for the street, but that did not stop riders from trying. And in the years that followed, it became clear why so many places made sure this machine stayed off public roads. When Honda first introduced the CR500R in the mid-1980s, it was aimed squarely at professional motocross. The engine was a single-cylinder, two-stroke unit, displacing 491 cubic centimeters, air-cooled in its early years, and later switched to liquid cooling. Right from the start, it was known for producing immense torque low in the rev range and continuing to build aggressively with throttle input. What made it distinct, even among other two-strokes, was the sheer violence of its delivery. There was no gradual climb. The bike either idled calmly or tried to tear out of your hands. Torque figures hovered around 50 pound-feet, a massive number for a single-cylinder dirt bike, weighing under 240 pounds. That torque arrived quickly, without electronics or damping to smooth it out. Even at partial throttle, the front wheel would lift, the rear would step out, and the rider had to stay ahead of the power to keep the machine upright. On loose surfaces, that made for an explosive off-road experience. On pavement, it became unpredictable. Despite not being built for street use, many CR500R units were converted by enthusiasts into road-going supermotos. During the 1990s and early 2000s, the conversions typically involved headlight kits, brake upgrades, and road tires, but the power delivery remained unchanged. That's where the problem started. Without traction control, rider aids, or street-tuned suspension, the CR's raw force became nearly impossible to manage in traffic. Sudden surges in power made slow-speed control difficult. Throttle response was abrupt enough to unsettle the chassis mid-turn, and the brakes, designed for dirt, lacked the bite needed for emergency stops on asphalt. Regulatory bodies began to take notice. In several U.S. states, especially California, road conversions of the CR500R were blocked outright. DMV offices stopped approving title transfers. Some insurance companies refused coverage altogether, citing the bike's off-road-only designation and lack of compliance with basic safety standards. Even in areas where it remained technically legal, emissions regulations posed another barrier. The two-stroke engine, designed without catalytic converters, emitted high levels of hydrocarbons and particulates, failing to meet road use standards. Manufacturers were also moving away from two-stroke power plants during this time. Honda discontinued the CR500R after the 2001 model year, with no plans to revise or modernize it for broader use. The remaining bikes, still popular in racing and hill climb events, became harder to register as years passed. In regions across Europe, South America, and parts of Australia, the CR was explicitly banned from street use under new vehicle type approvals and emissions mandates. The bans did not come down from a single ruling or event. Instead, the CR was slowly pushed out of public spaces through policy, regulation, and a growing awareness that some machines were simply too aggressive to share the road. It never failed because of flaws. It was removed because its capabilities belonged somewhere else. Today, the Honda CR500R still holds legendary status among off-road riders. But on the street, its time is over. You won't find it in traffic, at stoplights, or waiting at intersections, and that's exactly how most lawmakers intended it. Number 7. Kawasaki KR1S. Some bikes didn't get banned because they broke the rules. They got banned because they exposed the cracks in the system. The Kawasaki KR1S was one of the sharpest two-strokes of its time, but its street manners never caught up to its performance. What was supposed to be a lightweight race replica turned into a machine that outpaced the very roads it was built to ride on. It was designed to dominate the highly competitive 250 class, but unlike some of its rivals, the KR wasn't softened for public use. Instead, it stayed close to its racing roots, delivering a riding experience that left very little margin for error. On the surface, the engine was a two-stroke, parallel twin, liquid-cooled unit, displacing 249 cubic centimeters. But how it delivered that power is what set the tone for everything that followed. The revs needed to be high to get any real movement, and when the power finally came on, it didn't arrive gradually, it hit hard. That narrow power band created an on-off sensation that gave riders a short window to use full acceleration effectively. For experienced hands, that meant thrilling straight-line speed, but for the average rider, it made the bike twitchy, unpredictable, and difficult to manage in tight traffic or emergency situations. What made the KR1S increasingly dangerous, however, wasn't just its power delivery. It was the combination of that engine with a chassis that felt unstable at the edge. Reports began to emerge of high-speed tank slappers, especially under hard acceleration or braking on uneven surfaces. The short wheelbase and steep geometry, which worked well on smooth racetracks, often translated to nervous handling on real-world roads. Even when the tires were fresh and the suspension properly set, the front end could feel light and twitchy at highway speeds. As these issues became more widely known, the KR1S started gaining a reputation that worked against it. While it never had a major mechanical failure campaign, owners were reporting crashes linked to its unstable behavior, particularly in less than perfect road conditions. And once that kind of reputation forms, regulators and insurers start paying attention. At the same time, broader market forces were shifting. By the early 1990s, emissions standards were changing across Europe, Australia, and Japan. The two-stroke format, already under pressure, became an easy target. The KR1S, with its oil-burning engine and visible smoke output, couldn't meet the updated environmental rules. There were no factory fixes or retrofits, just a quiet phase-out as the model disappeared from showrooms. But emissions alone weren't what sealed its fate. In many regions, licensing rules also changed. Governments began cracking down on power-to-weight ratios for new riders, and lightweight two-strokes like the KR became incompatible with beginner restrictions. As licensing categories tightened, insurers followed suit. Premiums increased, coverage options shrank, and in some countries, registration was refused outright. Eventually, the combination of rider safety concerns, instability at speed, emission failures, and licensing incompatibility made the KR1S unmanageable in any legal sense. No recalls were issued, no public bans were announced. But slowly, through regulation, insurance withdrawal, and roadworthiness enforcement, the bike disappeared. Number 6. Bimota V-Do 500. Most motorcycles that get banned are pulled for what they do on the road. The Bimota V-Do 500 was different. It was pulled for what it couldn't do. Built with ambition and launched with hype, it was supposed to be a clean-burning two-stroke that changed the rules. But once the tires hit the street, the flaws showed up fast, and they never went away. Bimota introduced the V-Do in the late 1990s as a revolutionary project. At its core was a two-stroke, liquid-cooled, twin-cylinder engine with a displacement of 499 cubic centimeters. That on its own wasn't unusual. What was new and risky was the decision to use direct fuel injection in a two-stroke platform. The goal was to keep the performance of a traditional two-stroke while cutting emissions to meet tightening European regulations. On paper, it was exactly what the market needed. But in practice, the execution fell short. The first sign of trouble came with throttle control. Riders reported jerky on-off behavior that made the bike difficult to ride smoothly, especially at low speeds or while cornering. The throttle response wasn't just sharp, it was inconsistent. The fuel injection system, which was supposed to solve the tuning issues of carbureted two-strokes, introduced a new set of problems. Power delivery was unpredictable, and at times, completely detached from what the rider expected. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. And it didn't stop there. The engine, which produced just under 100 horsepower, had a habit of seizing without warning. In many cases, bikes were returned to dealers with serious mechanical issues before they had even covered 100 miles. Some suffered piston failures, others lost all power mid-ride, and a few locked up completely. No matter the symptom, the outcome was the same. Riders lost confidence fast. To make matters worse, these issues weren't isolated. They were widespread and consistent across early production models. Bimota issued updates, tried remapping ECUs, and even recalled several units, but nothing fully corrected the core design flaws. Eventually, the company offered to retrofit carburetors onto the bikes, essentially undoing the innovation that had justified the project in the first place. But by that point, it was already too late. As the failures stacked up, governments and regulatory bodies began to intervene. Several countries stopped approving the V-Do for registration altogether, citing safety risks and non-compliance with type approval standards. Insurers pulled support, dealers dropped the brand, and with customer trust gone and the financial impact mounting, Bimota was forced to halt production entirely. In less than 2 years, the V-Do went from breakthrough to breakdown. Bimota attempted a limited re-release with the Evoluzione models, but those were stripped of fuel injection and built in small batches for private use only. The original fuel-injected version was never sold again and became permanently unfit for road registration in most of the world. What makes the Bimota V-Do 500 stand apart is that it wasn't banned for being too wild or too fast. It was banned because it didn't work. It remains one of the few motorcycles removed, not for breaking the rules, but for failing to meet the minimum standard of staying on the road. Number 5. Kawasaki Ninja ZX-12R. There was a moment when the speed war between manufacturers reached a point that felt unsustainable, and standing at the center of that escalation was the Kawasaki Ninja ZX-12R. It wasn't just another high-performance sport bike. It was the machine that pushed so far, so fast, that it forced an entire industry to hit the brakes. Introduced in the early 2000s, the ZX-12R was Kawasaki's answer to the Suzuki Hayabusa, which had taken the top-speed crown just a few years earlier. But rather than simply match its rival, Kawasaki set out to reclaim the throne with something more aggressive, more aerodynamic, and more extreme. At the heart of the bike was a 4-cylinder, liquid-cooled engine displacing 1,199 cubic centimeters, supported by a 6-speed transmission and an aluminum monocoque frame that kept weight low and rigidity high. Power output was serious, over 178 horsepower at the crank in its unrestricted form. But the raw figures only told part of the story. What made the ZX-12R different was how quickly it translated that power into speed. The aerodynamics were tuned with wind tunnel testing. The intake system was ram air fed, and the entire chassis was shaped to hold stable at speeds that most highways couldn't legally allow. On open roads, the acceleration felt relentless, and the front end stayed light even at triple-digit speeds. That kind of speed, however, came with consequences. Even before the bike fully entered the market, concerns were raised by European and Japanese safety authorities about the escalation in top speed capabilities among production motorcycles. with unofficial test results showing that early pre-production ZX-12R units were capable of surpassing 195 miles per hour. Discussions began between manufacturers and regulators. By the time the bike reached showrooms, a voluntary agreement had been made. Several Japanese and European brands, including Kawasaki, agreed to electronically limit their flagship bikes to a maximum of 186 miles per hour. This wasn't a mechanical flaw or emissions issue, it was a deliberate industry move to avoid government-mandated restrictions that could have been far stricter. Still, not all markets received the same version. Some early units shipped before the agreement went into effect, and those bikes were quickly flagged. In regions like France and Germany, where vehicle testing was thorough, these unrestricted models were blocked from registration or retroactively pulled from road approval. In certain U.S. states, insurers began refusing coverage on early ZX-12R models due to top speed concerns and lack of formal compliance with the gentleman's agreement. Even the legal versions faced scrutiny. Riders reported stability issues at high speed, not due to mechanical faults, but simply because the speeds themselves left no margin for misjudgment. The bike's ability to build speed effortlessly meant that inexperienced riders could quickly find themselves in dangerous territory without realizing how fast things were moving. Production of the ZX-12R ended after a short run, with Kawasaki shifting its focus toward more balanced performance platforms. No major recall was issued, and the bike remained legal in many areas. But in others, particularly across Europe, it was quietly restricted, refused registration, or simply left out of compliance due to its pre-agreement speed. The Kawasaki Ninja ZX-12R wasn't banned because it failed. It was banned because it showed what was possible, and that possibility was enough to make everyone pull back. Number 4. MTT Y2K Turbine Superbike. Every motorcycle chases power, but only one tried to rewrite the rulebook using aviation technology. The MTT Y2K Turbine Superbike didn't evolve from sport bike tradition. It broke away from it entirely. Built around a turbine engine originally meant for helicopters, it offered a riding experience that had more in common with aviation than with anything on two wheels. Marine Turbine Technologies launched the Y2K in the early 2000s with one clear goal: to build the most powerful street-legal motorcycle in the world. At the core of the machine was a Rolls-Royce Allison Model 250 gas turbine engine, an aircraft power plant adapted for two-wheeled use. Displacement figures didn't apply in the traditional sense, but the output certainly did. The bike delivered over 320 horsepower and more than 425 pound-feet of torque, a number unmatched by any production motorcycle before or since. That level of torque arrived without delay and without the usual mechanical resistance of a piston engine. Twist the throttle, and the turbine spooled instantly, sending the rear wheel into violent motion. Acceleration wasn't just fast, it was overwhelming. The top speed was recorded well above 230 miles per hour, although few riders ever had the space or nerve to explore that fully. Despite being technically legal in the United States, the Y2K was not treated like a regular motorcycle by most authorities. Its turbine engine produced extreme heat, with exhaust temperatures capable of melting nearby surfaces. Riders were warned not to idle near vehicles, pedestrians, or gas station pumps. The noise, too, was unlike anything else. Rather than the rumble of a V-twin or the scream of an inline-4, the Y2K emitted a high-pitched jet whine that could be heard blocks away. Control was another issue. While the bike was engineered with stability in mind, including a long wheelbase and heavy-duty suspension, the power delivery didn't behave like anything street riders were trained to handle. The lack of engine braking, combined with a single-speed gearbox and direct-drive turbine, meant that traditional throttle and clutch inputs didn't apply. Misjudging the throttle could result in immediate wheel spin or uncontrolled acceleration, especially on slick roads or uneven terrain. As interest grew, concerns followed. In several countries, including parts of Europe and Asia, type approval was never granted for the Y2K, not because of emissions, but because of safety compliance. The turbine engine, while brilliant in engineering terms, failed to meet conventional motorcycle safety and noise standards. Without those certifications, road registration became impossible. Even in areas where it could be titled, insurance proved difficult to obtain. Most major providers refused to cover a turbine-powered motorcycle for public road use. Eventually, the MTT Y2K became less of a street bike and more of a high-speed curiosity, something to be trailered to events or demonstrated in controlled environments. MTT continued to refine the design and produce updated versions, but the original model never found its way back to the road in any real numbers. Number 3. RD500LC. It looked like something pulled from a race paddock and given just enough lights and mirrors to be legal. The Yamaha RD500LC wasn't trying to behave like a street bike. It was built to echo Grand Prix engineering, and that intent became clear the moment the throttle moved. But what made it appealing in the showroom is also what made it disappear from public roads not long after. Released in the mid-1980s, the RD500LC arrived as a direct response to Yamaha's racing success in the two-stroke era. Underneath the bodywork sat a liquid-cooled V4 engine displacing 499 cubic centimeters, fed by 4 individual carburetors and equipped with Yamaha's power valve system. The setup allowed for better low-end performance than most high-strung two-strokes, but the real purpose of the engine was to deliver peak power at high RPMs, exactly where street use became difficult to manage. The bike's appeal came from its close resemblance to factory race machines. It featured aluminum frame construction, aggressive geometry, and a tight riding position. The power band, though slightly broader than other two-strokes, was still abrupt. Riders had to keep the revs high to access full acceleration, and when it arrived, it came quickly and without much warning. While torque figures stayed near 38 pound-feet, the sensation of speed felt more dramatic due to the bike's low weight and sudden power delivery. Problems began when the RD500LC was introduced to real-world conditions. Poor fuel quality outside Europe, difficult cold starts, and the need for frequent tuning made ownership more complicated than most riders expected. In markets like North America, Yamaha opted not to release the bike at all due to emission restrictions and concerns about maintenance support. But that didn't stop gray market imports from arriving, especially in Canada and parts of the United States. Once those bikes hit the streets, regulatory issues followed. The two-stroke engine burned oil by design, and with no catalytic converter or emission controls, it quickly failed inspections in cities tightening their pollution standards. In some cases, customs agencies refused to release imported units. In others, owners could not secure titles or insurance, making the bike unrideable on public roads, unlike modern superbikes that were banned for excessive speed. The RD500LC was pulled out of circulation quietly. It wasn't unsafe. It was simply too specialized, too high maintenance, and too dirty for long-term road use. Yamaha never revised it, and no road-legal successor was built with the same format. Today it remains a favorite among collectors and vintage race enthusiasts, but you won't see one rolling legally through city traffic anymore. Number 2. Cagiva Mito 125. The Cagiva Mito 125 was never built to feel tame. It was designed to look and ride like a Grand Prix replica, even if the license plate suggested it was for entry-level riders. That contradiction is exactly what got it pushed off public roads. When the Mito launched in the late 1980s, it entered a market full of basic, slow-revving, small-displacement machines. But Cagiva went in the opposite direction. With styling inspired by the Ducati 816 and input from legendary designer Massimo Tamburini, the Mito stood out immediately. It was sleek, aggressive, and carried the silhouette of something far faster than its registration would suggest. Visually, it didn't look like it belonged in the same category as the other 125s. Beneath the fairings sat a single-cylinder, two-stroke, liquid-cooled engine, displacing 125 cubic centimeters, paired with a rare 7-speed gearbox. The engine delivered its power in a sharp, narrow band, high in the rev range. In restricted form, the Mito fit within legal learner limits. But once de-restricted, which many owners did with little effort, it produced over 33 horsepower and reached speeds well above 110 miles per hour. That kind of performance gave it the behavior of a much larger machine, all without moving out of the beginner class. The problem came when licensing systems across Europe and the United Kingdom began enforcing stricter controls on entry-level machines. Bikes like the Mito, which could be modified easily and outpaced nearly everything in their class, no longer matched the intent of A1 license categories. Governments responded by rewriting regulations, disqualifying the Mito from learner use, and forcing insurers to treat it as a high-risk vehicle. Meanwhile, environmental regulations were tightening as well. The Mito's two-stroke engine burned oil as part of its operation, producing high emissions and visible exhaust smoke. This placed it in violation of Euro-based emission standards, which became more aggressive throughout the 1990s and early 2000s. Cagiva attempted to keep the model alive with small updates, but the platform couldn't meet modern requirements without a complete redesign. Roadside inspections, particularly in larger cities, began flagging the mito for non-compliance. Riders who had de-restricted their bikes were often forced off the road entirely. Even stock units became difficult to insure or register, and over time, the bike quietly disappeared from the streets it once dominated. The Cagiva Mito 125 wasn't dangerous because it was unstable. It was dangerous because it gave full-size performance to riders who weren't expected to have it. And for a machine that once gave young riders a glimpse of race-level speed, that was the end of the road. Number 1. Gilera CX 125. Some motorcycles get banned because they go too fast, others because they pollute too much. But the Gilera CX 125 stands out for a different reason. It was simply too far ahead of its time, and the world around it was never ready. What started as a bold design experiment quickly became a machine that regulators, insurers, and riders quietly stepped away from. Launched in the early 1990s, the CX125 was Gilera's attempt to break away from convention. Every part of the bike was engineered to look and feel futuristic. The full body fairing enclosed nearly every component, giving it a wind tunnel sculpted silhouette that had more in common with concept bikes than production models. But the most radical feature wasn't the styling, it was the hub center front steering system. Instead of traditional forks, the CX used a single-sided swing arm on the front wheel, designed to separate braking and suspension forces. The idea was to improve stability under hard braking and reduce front-end dive. In theory, it offered real advantages, but in practice, the system made the steering feel numb and unfamiliar. Riders reported delayed input, unpredictable feedback, and an overall lack of trust in how the front end behaved, especially at higher speeds or during quick direction changes. The engine, while not especially powerful, still demanded rider awareness. It was a two-stroke, liquid-cooled single-cylinder displacing 125 cubic centimeters. Output sat just under 30 horsepower when unrestricted, and while torque was modest at around 15 pound-feet, it came high in the rev range. Combined with the unconventional steering and tight chassis geometry, the bike felt twitchy and unstable under aggressive riding conditions. That combination of radical design and unpredictable handling quickly caught the attention of safety authorities. While the CX technically met the performance limits for entry-level licensing categories in Europe, it failed to deliver the kind of control those categories expected. Multiple publications criticized the front-end behavior, and in response, regulators in several countries began questioning its roadworthiness. Licensing agencies started pulling it from learner class lists, and feedback from owners led insurers to hike rates or deny coverage entirely. At the same time, the emission restrictions caught up. Like other two-strokes of the era, the CX burned oil as it ran and emitted visible smoke and high levels of hydrocarbons. With emissions rules tightening across Europe, the bike's exhaust output made it a target. Gilera had no plan to redesign the model or bring it in line with evolving standards, and production was halted after only a few years. What made the CX's situation worse was that it wasn't just banned outright. It was slowly squeezed out by a mix of technical scrutiny, safety concerns, and environmental pressure. Spare parts became harder to source, inspections became more difficult to pass, and eventually the bike disappeared from roads altogether, not because it failed in one area, but because it failed to meet the real-world demands. The Gilera CX 125 never got the chance to evolve. Its design was bold, its ambition clear, but its execution proved too difficult to support. Whether it was speed, emissions, or sheer unpredictability, these bikes proved the street couldn't handle them. If you know a motorcycle that met the same fate, let us know below. Hit like and subscribe for more rides that push the limit.